I am Victor Caldwell. I am 70 years old, and I spent 40 years in commercial construction, building a life so my only daughter would never have to struggle. I gave my son-in-law $2.5 million in cash to build her a custom dream home in the suburbs. But last week, an old neighbor grabbed my arm at the supermarket and whispered something that made my blood run absolute cold. He was secretly moving another woman into that house. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe betrayal from family is the ultimate unforgivable sin. I was standing in the floral section of a Trader Joe's in downtown Chicago. It was a Tuesday evening, bitterly cold and damp, the kind of weather that settles deep into your bones. I was only there to buy a large bouquet of blue hydrangeas for my daughter Melanie. She loved hydrangeas. She was hosting a small dinner party that night at her apartment, and I was raised with the belief that a gentleman never shows up empty-handed, especially not to his own child's home. I was carefully inspecting the stems, picking out the healthiest-looking flowers, when a hand suddenly gripped my wrist. The grip was shockingly tight, almost desperate. I looked down and saw Martha. She was an old neighbor of mine, a woman who used to live right next door to me in my old neighborhood, before I sold my property to fund my daughter's future. Martha looked absolutely terrified. Her eyes were wide, darting frantically around the grocery store aisles as if she expected someone to be watching her from the shadows. "Victor," she whispered, pulling my arm to draw me closer. "You need to listen to me. Your son-in-law is hiding something terrible from you. He did not build that mansion for Melanie." I stared at her. I am a man who deals in concrete facts and steel beams. I do not easily tolerate neighborhood gossip or dramatic nonsense. I asked her calmly what she was talking about. Derek Lawson was my son-in-law. He was a successful real estate developer. I had personally signed a certified check for $2.5 million straight out of my retirement savings to fund the construction of a sprawling suburban estate for them. It was supposed to be Melanie's forever home, a place where they could finally start a family. Martha shook her head vigorously, her fingers digging deeper into the fabric of my heavy winter coat. "I drive past that property every single morning on my way to my sister's house," she said, her voice dropping to a trembling whisper. "Yesterday, I saw a massive moving truck parked in the driveway. Derek was there, standing on the front porch. But he was not with Melanie. He was holding the front door wide open for another woman, a heavily pregnant woman. And Victor, and I swear to God, she was wearing a diamond ring the size of a marble. They were laughing together like a married couple. He literally carried her designer bags inside. I felt a strange, freezing stillness wash over my entire body. It was the kind of absolute, deafening quiet you feel right before a steel support beam snaps on a massive job site. I did not gasp. I did not cry. I am a 70-year-old man who has seen the worst of the world, and I am not a man who panics. I just looked directly into Martha's terrified eyes, thanked her quietly for her time, and walked away. I left the blue hydrangeas right there on the display shelf. I did not need flowers anymore. I needed answers. The drive to their downtown luxury apartment took exactly 40 minutes. During that entire drive, my mind worked like a calculating machine. I had survived 4 brutal decades in the cutthroat world of commercial construction. You simply do not survive in that industry by blindly trusting smooth-talking developers in expensive, tailored suits. You survive by aggressively reading the blueprints, inspecting the foundation, and finding the hidden cracks before the whole building collapses on top of you. Derek Lawson had always been a little too smooth for my liking, a little too perfect. But Melanie loved him deeply, so I had played the role of the quiet, supportive father. I unlocked their front door and walked into the high-rise apartment. The contrast hit me the second I stepped through the entryway. The place smelled of expensive, catered food and imported French wine. Derek was standing by the marble kitchen island. He was 36 years old, impeccably dressed, in a tailored silk shirt with his sleeves rolled up, laughing and confidently pouring a vintage Bordeaux into crystal glasses. He looked vibrant, ridiculously wealthy, and completely untouchable. Then I looked across the room at my daughter. Melanie was 34 years old, a highly dedicated emergency room nurse who used to have boundless energy. But tonight, she did not look like herself at all. She was sitting slumped on the living room sofa, clutching a simple glass of tap water. Her skin was ghastly pale, completely devoid of any natural color. Deep, dark purple bags hung heavily under her eyes. She looked dangerously exhausted, constantly rubbing her temples with her fingertips, as if she were fighting off a severe migraine that simply would not end. She looked like a woman who was slowly fading away into a ghost. "Hey, Dad!" Derek called out enthusiastically, flashing that brilliant, perfectly practiced smile of his. "I am so glad you could make it tonight. The wine is breathing, and dinner is almost ready to be served." I kept my face entirely neutral, locking my emotions away behind a wall of pure discipline. I walked over to the sofa and gently kissed Melanie on the top of her head. She leaned into my chest, her body feeling shockingly frail and weak beneath my hands. She murmured a quiet, tired hello, telling me she was just feeling a bit under the weather lately. Derek quickly interjected from the kitchen, waving his hand dismissively. He said she was just working way too many double shifts at the hospital and needed some rest. He poured me a large glass of red wine, flawlessly playing the role of the ultimate caring host. I took the glass from his hand. I did not drink a single drop. I just stood there leaning against the counter, watching him closely. I needed to test the structural integrity of his lies. I needed to apply pressure and see exactly where the concrete would crack. "So Derek," I said, keeping my tone perfectly flat and casual, "how is the construction going out at the suburban estate? The interior framing should be completely done by now, right?" Derek did not miss a beat. "Oh, it is coming along absolutely great, Victor. We had a few minor delays with the global supply chain, but you know how the industry is right now. We are aiming to have the whole place move in ready for Melanie by early spring." I took a slow, deliberate step toward the kitchen island, closing the physical distance between us. "That is very interesting," I said softly. "I was actually driving out near the property yesterday afternoon. I thought I would check on my $2.5 million investment." I paused, letting the heavy silence stretch out just long enough to make the air in the room feel thick and uncomfortable. I noticed a very large moving truck parked right in the main driveway. It looked like someone was carrying heavy boxes inside. I kept my eyes locked entirely on his hand, the hand holding the expensive bottle of wine. For a fraction of a second, his fingers froze. The steady stream of dark red liquid stopped dead in the air. A micro-expression of sheer, unadulterated panic flashed across his eyes. It was barely a blink, but to a man trained to spot structural flaws, it was as loud as a blaring siren. The muscles in his sharp jawline tightened involuntarily. His breathing hitched in his throat. Then, just as quickly as it appeared, the mask slipped perfectly back into place. The charming, relaxed smile returned to his handsome face. He finished pouring the wine and set the heavy glass bottle down on the marble counter with a soft clink. "Oh, that," Derek chuckled smoothly, grabbing a cloth to wipe a stray drop of wine from the pristine counter. "That was just the luxury staging company, Victor. We are having some custom designer furniture delivered early so they can measure out the exact living room dimensions. You know how these high-end interior designers get. They want everything to look absolutely perfect before Melanie even steps foot inside the house." He looked over at Melanie with a sickeningly sweet, loving expression. "Only the absolute best for my beautiful wife," he said smoothly. Melanie smiled weakly from the couch, completely oblivious to the dark tension radiating in the room. She trusted him entirely. She leaned her heavy head back against the cushions and closed her eyes, looking so incredibly fragile and helpless. I looked back at Derek. I saw the arrogant confidence radiating from his posture. He genuinely thought he had smoothed the situation over effortlessly. He thought I was just a retired, clueless old man who did not understand modern real estate staging practices. He honestly thought he was the smartest person in the room. "Right," I said quietly, my voice betraying nothing. "Custom staging. That makes perfect sense, Derek." I smiled back at him. but it was a cold, completely hollow smile. I did not push the issue any further. I did not yell or accuse him or flip the dining table. I simply pulled out my chair, sat down for dinner, and ate my meal in absolute silence. I let him think he had won the game. I let him believe his dark secret was safe. Because in that exact moment, my gut told me everything I ever needed to know. The moving truck was real. The pregnant woman was real. And the sickly, fading appearance of my only daughter was absolutely not just from working long shifts at the hospital. Derek Lawson was hiding something sick and twisted behind those imported custom cabinets. And starting tonight, I was going to tear his entire world apart brick by brick to find out exactly what it was. Dinner felt like chewing on dry sawdust. Derek dominated the conversation, bragging about his latest real estate acquisitions, while Melanie barely picked at her roasted salmon. She looked as though simply lifting her fork required a monumental effort. When the plates were cleared, Derek clapped his hands, suggesting we step out onto the balcony. He claimed he wanted my professional opinion on some patio heaters he was thinking of installing. I knew exactly what this manipulative coward was doing. He wanted to isolate me from my daughter. He needed to assess if I had actually bought his pathetic, fabricated story about the staging company. I followed him out into the freezing Chicago night, the sliding glass door pulling shut behind us and sealing us off from the warmth of the apartment. The second the heavy glass clicked into place, the charismatic host routine instantly vanished. Derek turned to me, his jaw set, no longer pretending to smile. He poured a stiff drink from a decanter, taking a long sip before looking me directly in the eyes. I stepped forward, backing him against the wrought iron railing. "Do not insult my intelligence, Derek," I said, keeping my voice dangerously low. "I spent 40 years running construction sites. I know the difference between a staging crew and a residential move, and staging companies do not send heavily pregnant women wearing diamond rings to arrange throw pillows in unfinished houses. Tell me, who exactly is she?" For a brief, deeply uncomfortable moment, he stared right at me. Then he let out a long, heavy sigh, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. He completely dropped the confident developer facade and instantly morphed into a burdened, exhausted man carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. It was a masterclass in emotional manipulation. "Victor," he said, his voice dripping with fabricated sincerity, "I swear to you I was going to tell you everything. I just did not want to panic you, and I certainly could not risk Melanie finding out." I crossed my arms, completely unmoved. "Try me now." He leaned against the railing, adopting the posture of a tragic hero. "The woman you saw is named Cassandra. She is the widow of one of my top framing subcontractors. 2 months ago, there was an accident at my downtown commercial site. A scaffolding collapse. It was a complete nightmare, Victor. Her husband fell 3 stories. He did not make it. He left her completely destitute and 8 months pregnant." I listened in silence, analyzing every syllable. She was preparing to file a massive wrongful death lawsuit against my company. Derek continued, his voice dropping to a somber whisper. "A lawsuit of that magnitude would trigger a chain reaction. It would have frozen all my assets. It would have stalled the mansion construction indefinitely. And worse, Victor, it would have put the $2.5 million you gave us in serious jeopardy. I had to protect your equity. I had to protect Melanie's future. So you moved a grieving widow into my daughter's home," I replied, my tone remaining flat and cold. "It is strictly temporary," Derek insisted, stepping closer to me, desperately trying to sell the massive lie. "I struck a private settlement with her. I agreed to let her live in the finished guest wing rent-free until the baby is born. In exchange, she agreed to drop the litigation entirely. I bought her the diamond ring as a peace offering from the company. I am just trying to do the right thing, Victor. I am trying to keep our family safe from a financial disaster." The story was incredibly neat. It was woven with just enough industry logic to sound entirely plausible to a retired contractor. Wrongful death suits do freeze assets. Subcontractor accidents do happen. But a true professional knows that OSHA would have been swarming the site. There would have been safety bulletins, insurance adjusters, and local news reports. I had seen none of that. Still, I kept my face blank. "Why keep it a secret from Melanie?" I asked. "She is a nurse. She understands tragedy better than anyone." Derek's expression instantly darkened, shifting from a tragic hero to a fiercely protective husband. He pointed a finger at the glass door separating us from the living room. "Look at her, Victor. Just look at her." I turned my head. Through the glass, I saw Melanie sitting exactly where we had left her. She was staring blankly at the muted television screen, her head drooping forward, looking absolutely hollowed out. "Her anxiety has been crippling lately," Derek whispered, stepping right next to my shoulder. "You have no idea how bad it has gotten behind closed doors. She barely sleeps. She cries for no reason. The doctor just had to double her daily sedatives just to keep her functioning. If I told her that a man died on one of my sites, that we were facing a ruinous lawsuit, the stress would completely break her. I am shielding her, Victor. I am carrying this burden alone so she does not have to." He was using my daughter's deteriorating health as a weapon against me. He was painting himself as her savior, daring me to shatter her fragile peace with my suspicions. It was a deeply vile, calculated move. He knew my only priority was keeping Melanie safe, and he was using that exact instinct to build a fortress around his lies. Before I could challenge his story, the sliding glass door rattled open. Melanie stepped out onto the freezing balcony. She was not wearing a coat, just a thin silk blouse. She shivered violently, rubbing her arms, her eyes struggling to focus on the two of us. "Derek," she murmured, her voice slurring slightly, the syllables heavy and thick. "It is cold. Why are you guys out here?" My head is spinning again. Derek instantly rushed to her side, playing the part perfectly. He wrapped his expensive suit jacket tightly around her trembling shoulders, kissing her forehead with a sickening display of overwhelming affection. "We were just talking about the patio heaters, baby," he said smoothly, wrapping his arm securely around her fragile waist. "Let us get you back inside. You need to lie down and let the medicine work. You are pushing yourself too hard." Melanie leaned her entire body weight against him, completely dependent on his support. She looked up at me with tired, clouded eyes. "He takes such good care of me, Dad," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the howling wind. "I do not know what I would do without him. He is my absolute rock." I forced myself to completely swallow the burning, violent rage. I nodded slowly, looking directly into his blindly triumphant, deeply arrogant eyes. He genuinely thought he had won. He believed I was a foolish, tired old man. "You are right, Derek," I said quietly. "She desperately needs her rest right now." I turned and walked into the bitter, freezing Chicago night. He thought I bought his pathetic, carefully constructed lie. But I knew exactly where I was going to start my digging tomorrow morning. I drove back to my house in the quiet suburbs, the rhythmic hum of the tires against the freezing asphalt, the only sound in the car. I had spent 40 years pouring concrete, erecting steel frames, and dealing with every type of hazard and catastrophe you can imagine on a commercial build. I knew the regulations backward and forward. Derek was a smooth talker, but he had made a fatal miscalculation. He had tried to use construction jargon to pacify a man who had helped write the local building codes. A subcontractor dying in a scaffolding collapse is not something you can just sweep under the rug with a private settlement and a shiny diamond ring. When a fatal accident happens on a job site, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration steps in immediately. The site gets shut down. The police establish a perimeter. Investigators swarm the area, pulling permits, inspecting harnesses, and interviewing every single worker on the payroll. It generates a massive paper trail. It becomes public record within hours. You do not just move the grieving widow into your luxury property and pretend nothing happened. As soon as I walked through my front door, I completely ignored the blinking light on my answering machine. I went straight to my home office and booted up my desktop computer. I brewed a pot of black coffee and settled into my leather chair. I logged into the federal safety databases. I searched through the state labor board records. I pulled up every local news outlet covering the greater Chicago area for the past 6 months. I searched for scaffolding collapses. I searched for construction fatalities. I searched for anything remotely connected to Derek's real estate development company. I sat in front of that glowing screen until 3 in the morning, cross-referencing every single keyword I could think of. The result was exactly what my gut had told me on that balcony. 0. There were 0 reported accidents. There were 0 fatalities. There were 0 official investigations linked to Derek or any of his known subsidiaries. The story he had told me with such heavy, burdened sincerity was a complete fabrication from start to finish. Cassandra was not a grieving widow. I did not sleep that night. When the sun finally began to rise over the frozen lake, casting a pale gray light into my study, my focus shifted entirely from the mysterious woman to my daughter. Melanie's appearance at the apartment haunted me. The way her skin looked so translucent, the thick sluggishness of her words, the absolute dependency she showed toward a man I now knew was a pathological liar. Derek had claimed her anxiety was crippling, that her doctor had doubled her sedatives. But Melanie was an emergency room nurse. She thrived in high-pressure situations. She spent her days stabilizing trauma patients and managing chaotic crisis scenarios. Severe paralyzing anxiety was completely out of character for the strong, resilient woman I had raised. At 8 in the morning, I put on my heavy wool coat and drove straight to the hospital where Melanie worked. I walked through the sliding glass doors of the emergency department, sidestepping the morning rush of paramedics and patients. I went directly to the nurses' station and asked for Brenda, the senior shift supervisor. Brenda had known Melanie for years. She was a tough, no-nonsense woman who practically ran the entire floor. When she saw me standing there, her stern expression immediately softened into a look of deep, genuine concern. "Victor," she said, walking around the counter to greet me, "it is so good to see you. How is she doing?" We have all been so worried about her. I kept my posture relaxed, casually, slipping my hands into my pockets. "She is resting," I said smoothly, not wanting to raise any alarms. I was just in the neighborhood and thought I would drop by to see how things were running without her. Brenda's sigh was heavy with sympathy. "It has been a nightmare around here without her, honestly. She is one of the best trauma nurses I have ever had on my team. We really hope this medical leave does not last much longer, but her health absolutely has to come first." I felt a sudden, sharp coldness grip the back of my neck. I maintained my calm facade, making sure my voice did not shake. "Remind me, Brenda, how long has she been out now? The days just blur together lately." Brenda looked at me with a touch of confusion. "She has been on indefinite medical leave for exactly 2 months, Victor. Did Derek not tell you? 2 full months. My only daughter had not been to work in 2 entire months, and Derek had said absolutely nothing about it. He had let me believe she was just exhausted from picking up extra shifts. Yes, of course, I lied effortlessly. But you know how Derek is. He tries to shield me from the worst of it." "How bad did it get before she finally stepped away?" Brenda lowered her voice, stepping closer so the passing orderlies would not hear. "It was terrifying, Victor. It started with simple dizzy spells, but it escalated so fast. She kept passing out right here in the trauma bay. Her blood pressure would just inexplicably bottom out. Then came the memory loss. She would forget standard protocols she had known for a decade. She told me that the room would start spinning so violently she could not even stand up straight. We practically had to force her to go on leave. The doctors here ran a dozen blood panels, but they could not pinpoint the exact cause of the vertigo. Derek finally stepped in and said he was taking her to a private specialist. We have not seen her since." I thanked Brenda for her time, keeping my polite smile until I stepped out the sliding glass doors. The moment the frigid air hit my face, the mask vanished. I walked back to my car, my boots crunching heavily against the salted pavement. 2 months. 2 entire months of passing out extreme vertigo and severe cognitive decline. That was not anxiety. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. I thought back to the dinner the previous night. I pictured Melanie's glassy eyes. I remembered the heavy, sluggish way her head had slumped against the sofa cushions and the way she slurred her words on the balcony. Derek had poured that wine with such steady, confident hands. This was no longer a financial dispute about a $2.5 million house. This was no longer just a case of a greedy son-in-law hiding a pregnant mistress in the suburbs. My daughter was not suffering from a sudden onset of mysterious psychiatric issues. She was being systematically dismantled. The man she married, the man sleeping beside her every single night, was doing something horrific to her physical body. The game had completely changed forever. I was no longer fighting to protect my hard-earned money, and the stakes were now a matter of life and death for my only child. I drove straight from the hospital to my home office. The cold Chicago air seeping through the car vents felt refreshing. I needed that cold to keep my mind sharp. I was dealing with a predator who was actively dismantling my daughter's health and isolating her from the world. A man like that builds his traps meticulously. And if Derek was manipulating Melanie's medical state, he was absolutely manipulating the finances. I booted up my desktop computer and bypassed the public-facing search engines. 40 years in the commercial construction business means you know exactly where the real blueprints are buried. I logged into the deep-level county property databases using my old commercial contractor credentials. I typed in the address of the sprawling suburban estate, the same property I had personally funded with a cashier's check for $2.5 million. Derek and I had sat in my living room 3 years ago, shaking hands over a bottle of scotch. We had agreed the property would be held in a specialized family trust, ensuring Melanie would always have equal ownership and complete protection. I hit the search key. The property deed populated on the screen in a stark black and white document. I scrolled past the zoning permits, my eyes scanning for the ownership registry. The words on the screen made my jaw lock. The property was not registered under any family trust. My name was nowhere on the document. Melanie's name was completely absent. The sole owner of the estate was a private, anonymous, limited liability company named C&D Holdings. I stared at the bold letters, feeling a surge of pure, freezing anger. Derek had legally hijacked my $2.5 million, funneling my life savings into an untraceable corporate entity. He had used my money to buy a mansion for himself and his pregnant mistress, leaving my daughter with absolutely zero equity. It was a perfectly executed financial assassination. I printed the deed, folded the paper neatly, and slid it into the inner pocket of my heavy wool coat. It was 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Derek was downtown at a client meeting presenting his architectural proposals. I knew this was my only window to see Melanie alone. I drove back into the city, navigating the slush-covered streets with absolute precision. I arrived at their apartment building and bypassed the doorman using the spare key card Melanie had given me months ago for emergencies. I knocked on the heavy wooden door of their unit. It took a long time for her to answer. When the door finally swung open, my heart sank deeply into my chest. Melanie was wearing a loose bathrobe, looking even more frail and disoriented than she had the night before. Her hands trembled as she held the doorframe for balance. She offered a weak, confused smile, asking what I was doing there so early in the day. I kept my voice incredibly gentle, telling her I just wanted to drop off some warm soup. We sat together on the expensive living room sofa. I tried to engage her in simple conversation, asking about her favorite books or the weather, trying to gauge her cognitive awareness. Her responses were incredibly sluggish. She kept losing her train of thought, staring blankly at the far wall, as if her mind was constantly fighting to stay awake. Within 15 minutes, her chin dropped to her chest. Right in the middle of a sentence about her hospital schedule, my brilliant, highly educated daughter simply passed out, falling into a deep, unnatural sleep. I sat perfectly still, listening to the shallow, uneven rhythm of her breathing. A deep paternal instinct roared inside me, urging me to scoop her up, carry her down to my car, and drive her straight to a trusted medical facility. But my decades of experience in the construction business grounded me. If I removed her from the apartment right now, Derek would instantly know I was onto him. He would panic, destroy the financial evidence, and flee the state with Cassandra. I had to secure the perimeter before I could rescue the hostage. I noticed her smartphone resting on the glass coffee table, completely unguarded. I picked it up carefully. Melanie had always used the same simple passcode since she was in college, a combination of her late mother's birth year and my birth month. I typed the numbers in. The screen unlocked immediately. I did not care about invading her privacy. I cared about keeping her alive. I bypassed the standard applications and went straight into the core system settings. What I found there chilled me to the absolute bone. Hidden deep inside a utility folder masquerading as a basic battery optimization tool was a highly sophisticated tracking application. It was military-grade surveillance software, the kind used by paranoid executives to monitor corporate espionage. It was tracking her exact global positioning coordinates 24 hours a day, logging her every movement with pinpoint accuracy. I dug deeper, carefully opening her email application and her banking portal. I checked the forwarding rules and the security permissions. The depth of his control was staggering. Every single bank notification, every medical appointment reminder, every text message from her friends, and every email she received was automatically copied and forwarded directly to Derek's personal server. He had placed a tight digital leash around her neck. He monitored her spending, her communications, her locations, and her relationships. She was a literal prisoner in her own life, completely isolated and blind to the invisible cage built around her. If she tried to reach out to a colleague for help, Derek would instantly know. If she tried to transfer funds to a separate account, Derek would know. He had engineered a situation where she was entirely dependent on him, both physically, through the toxic pills, and digitally, through his absolute surveillance. He had effectively cut off all her exits. I closed the applications one by one. I wiped the screen carefully with my sleeve to remove any lingering fingerprints. I placed the phone back on the glass coffee table, positioning it at the exact same angle I had found it. I stood up and looked down at my sleeping daughter. Her chest rose and fell slowly beneath the heavy bathrobe. I gently pulled a woven throw blanket over her shoulders, making sure she was warm. I walked to the heavy front door, my heavy steps completely silent against the hardwood floor. I did not feel fear, and I no longer felt the blind, chaotic rage of a betrayed father. I felt the absolute freezing clarity of a man preparing for total war. Derek Lawson had stolen my money, mocked my intelligence, and systematically poisoned my only child. He thought he was untouchable behind his fake smiles and his anonymous corporate holdings. He thought he had outsmarted a clueless old man. But I had spent my entire life building skyscrapers from the ground up, and I knew exactly how to demolish a structure with a few perfectly placed explosives. War was officially declared today, and I was going to bury him under the rubble. I needed a battlefield to dictate the engagement perfectly. I invited Derek to dinner at Gibson's Bar and Steakhouse. It was a fitting arena for the performance of my life. I arrived 20 minutes early. I instructed the waiter to bring me club soda with a lime twist, making it look exactly like my usual gin and tonic. I needed a clear head, but Derek needed to think I was actively numbing my senses. When he walked into the dimly lit restaurant, he carried himself with arrogant swagger. He spotted me at the corner booth and glided over, flashing his perfectly white, practiced teeth. He wore a tailored navy suit, looking like a highly successful developer who had the world dancing in his palm. I did not stand up to greet him. Instead, I let my broad shoulders slump forward heavily. I made sure my hands were resting flat on the white tablecloth with a constant tremor. I looked up at him with tired, glassy eyes, perfectly mimicking the exhausted, defeated posture of a man who was rapidly losing his solid grip on reality. Derek sat down across from me, ordering a scotch, neat without even glancing at the menu. He asked me how I was doing, his smooth voice dripping with that fabricated concern he had mastered so well. I let out a long, ragged sigh. I told him that I was not doing very well. I leaned in close, lowering my voice so he had to strain to hear me over the noise. I confessed that my mind had been feeling foggy lately. I told him I was forgetting names, misplacing my car keys, and struggling to keep up with daily tasks around my house. I painted a tragic picture of a 70-year-old man terrified of his own cognitive decline. Derek's eyes widened slightly. I could practically see the gears turning behind his forehead. He leaned forward, placing his hand over mine on the table. He told me that aging was difficult, but that I had him and Melanie to rely on. He promised them that they would take care of everything. I nodded weakly, pulling my hand away to reach into my leather briefcase. I pulled out a manila envelope and placed it between our dinner plates. I told him that my physician had strongly recommended a long, stress-free vacation. I said I was planning to fly down to Naples, Florida for a month, to rest my tired brain and escape the Chicago winter. But I added, my voice cracking on the syllable, I was deeply worried about my financial obligations while I was so far away. I opened the envelope and slid a stack of legal documents across the table. It was a limited power of attorney, complete with blue seals. I explained that it only granted him access to one of my minor business accounts, an account I used primarily for managing small property taxes and miscellaneous contractor fees. I told him I needed someone sharp and capable to handle these tedious things while I was gone. I told him I needed a son I could trust. Derek stared blankly at the dense legal documents. He tried desperately to maintain a solemn, deeply concerned facial expression, but he simply could not hide the sheer, unadulterated greed that instantly flooded his calculating eyes. It was a fleeting, hungry gleam, a predatory excitement that validated every single dark suspicion I held in my chest. He saw this minor power of attorney not as a familial chore, but as the very first crack in the massive dam. He firmly believed that if I was willing to voluntarily surrender even a small fraction of my financial independence right now, it was only a matter of time before he could maneuver his devious way into controlling my entire $10 million estate. He picked up the heavy brass pen sitting beside the leather check presenter and signed his name on the dotted line with eager sweeping strokes. He looked across the polished table and swore to me that my finances would be entirely safe in his capable hands. He told me to go to sunny Florida and focus completely on restoring my health. I thanked him sincerely, offering him a frail, highly grateful smile. I paid the exorbitant dinner bill, using cash fumbling clumsily with the large bills to flawlessly reinforce the illusion of my rapidly failing dexterity. The invisible hook was set perfectly. The parasite had taken the bait without a single second thought. The following morning, Derek insisted on personally driving me to O'Hare International Airport. He arrived at my house bright and early, happily loading my 2 heavy suitcases into the spacious trunk of his luxury sedan with performative enthusiasm. During the 40-minute drive down the congested Kennedy Expressway, the radio played softly in the background, while he fully played the role of the doting, fiercely protective son-in-law with absolute nauseating perfection. He repeatedly assured me that he would keep a very close eye on Melanie while I was gone. He promised to ensure she took all her prescribed medications right on schedule. It took every single ounce of physical restraint I possessed not to reach aggressively across the leather center console and wrap my calloused hands around his throat right then and there. I simply nodded slowly, looking out the passenger window at the passing snowbanks, silently counting the passing miles until I could finally be rid of his toxic presence. We pulled up to the departures curb at Terminal 3. The morning wind whipped violently around us, smelling of jet fuel and exhaust, as Derek unloaded my bags onto the icy concrete sidewalk. He turned to me and pulled me into a tight hug. He patted my back rhythmically, telling me to enjoy the warm sunshine and to call them the second my flight landed safely in Naples. I hugged him back loosely, forcing my body to feel rigid and incredibly old in his strong arms. I thanked him yet again for stepping up and taking care of my vulnerable family. I grabbed the handle of my rolling suitcase and turned slowly toward the massive sliding glass doors of the busy terminal. I walked at a painfully slow, awkward, shuffling pace, dragging my heavy feet slightly against the cold concrete. I knew he was standing silently by his running car, watching my steady retreat to ensure I actually walked through those automatic doors. I joined the long, winding security line, I kept my broad shoulders heavily slumped, my head bowed down, looking exactly like the broken, helpless senior citizen Derek desperately needed me to be. I shuffled aimlessly through the metal detectors, moving with the sluggish hesitance of a man whose spirit had been entirely crushed. I waited patiently until I had passed completely through the security checkpoint and rounded the sharp corner into the busy main concourse. Once I was entirely out of his line of sight, the miserable old man vanished forever. I finally stood, tall, breathed in the dry, recycled airport air, and calmly prepared my mind to systematically dismantle his entire life from the ground up. I watched the silver bumper of Derek's luxury sedan disappear into the chaotic flow of airport traffic. The absolute second his car merged onto the highway, I let the heavy, pathetic posture I had been holding completely fall away. I rolled my shoulders back until my spine popped, standing at my full natural height. The arthritis act was exhausting, but it had worked flawlessly. I grabbed the handle of my luggage, gripping it with the firm strength of a man who had spent 4 decades hauling raw materials and briskly navigated my way through the dense crowds of travelers. I completely bypassed the departure gates and took the long underground walkway toward the rental car pavilions. I did not go to any of the major corporate kiosks that required a digital reservation or a traceable credit card. I found a small independent vendor located at the very end of the terminal. I handed the clerk a stack of crisp $20 bills and presented a secondary identification card I kept specifically for emergencies. 10 minutes later, I was sitting behind the wheel of a generic dark gray sedan. It was completely unremarkable, exactly the kind of vehicle that blends seamlessly into the endless flow of Chicago traffic. I pulled out of the parking garage and merged onto the expressway, heading directly back into the freezing heart of the city I had supposedly just left. My mind was no longer clouded by the immediate grief of seeing my daughter suffer. It was incredibly sharp, operating with a cold, mechanical precision. I drove toward the grim industrial district on the south side, far away from the glittering high-rises of downtown, where Derek spent his days playing his arrogant games. I needed a base of operations, and I needed a professional who understood how to navigate the deepest shadows of the financial world. I pulled into the cracked, uneven asphalt parking lot of a cheap cash-only motel right off the interstate. The neon sign above the main office flickered violently in the winter wind. It was the perfect place to disappear. I walked into room 112 carrying my suitcase. Sitting at the small, peeling laminate table by the window was Cole Jenkins. Cole was a ruthless ex-federal private investigator who specialized exclusively in unraveling complex white-collar financial crimes. We had worked together 10 years ago when a corrupt supplier tried to embezzle millions from one of my commercial builds. Cole had completely destroyed that man in less than a week. He was a man of very few words, possessing a terrifyingly calm demeanor and an unmatched ability to rip through corporate firewalls like paper. He looked up from his glowing laptop screen as I locked the deadbolt behind me. "You look surprisingly good for a man who is supposed to be resting his failing heart in sunny Florida," Cole said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. I tossed my heavy coat onto the lumpy motel bed and pulled up a cheap plastic chair across from him. "I do not have a failing heart, Cole," I replied firmly. "But my son-in-law is going to need a pacemaker by the time we are finished with him." I opened my briefcase and pulled out the property deed I had printed the day before. I slid the crisp white paper across the table, tapping my finger heavily on the bold black ink that listed the property owner. "I need you to tear this entire entity apart," I instructed him, my voice completely devoid of any emotion. "The company is registered as C&D Holdings. Derek convinced me to write a $2.5 million check to fund a custom suburban estate for my daughter. He promised me the property would be secured safely in a family trust. Instead, he hijacked my money and hid the entire estate inside this anonymous shell company. I need to know exactly when this entity was legally formed, who the primary shareholders are, and where every single penny of my money has been routed." Cole picked up the document, his sharp eyes scanning the legal jargon with predatory speed. Shell companies in real estate are usually designed to hide illicit assets from spouses or tax auditors. He stated plainly, setting the paper down. If he bypassed your family trust, he did it deliberately to ensure your daughter holds zero equity in the event of a sudden divorce or death. I felt a familiar icy rage tighten my chest at his words, but I kept my breathing perfectly steady. There is something else, I said, leaning closer to the table. I want a complete, exhaustive background check on a woman named Cassandra. I do not have her last name, but she is currently living inside that exact same estate. She is heavily pregnant, wearing a massive diamond engagement ring, and Derek is actively financing her entire lifestyle. He tried to tell me she was the destitute widow of a subcontractor who died on one of his commercial sites. He claimed he was settling a wrongful death lawsuit off the books. I already checked the federal safety databases. There are no reported accidents. The story is a complete fabrication. I need to know her real name, her true relationship to my son-in-law, and exactly how long she has been in the picture. Cole nodded slowly, his fingers already flying rapidly across his laptop keyboard, pulling up secure databases that average citizens never even know exist. Consider it done, Victor. I will track the property tax payments and cross-reference the utility bills for that address. If she is living there, her name is tied to a service grid somewhere. Give me 48 hours to completely dismantle this C&D holding structure. What are you going to do in the meantime? I stood up from the plastic chair and walked over to my suitcase. I unzipped the main compartment and pulled out a heavy canvas duffel bag. The bag clinked with the sound of solid steel tools. I am going to do exactly what I have done for my entire life, I told him, checking the heavy flashlight and the specialized lock bypass kits I had carefully packed. I am going to inspect a building. I knew that custom estate inside and out. 2 years ago, when the project was just a massive dirt lot and a dream, I had sat at my dining room table with Derek, personally helping him draft the foundational blueprints. I had advised him on the structural load-bearing walls, the electrical grid layouts, and the complex security system integration. I knew exactly where all the exterior and interior camera blind spots were. I knew the specific manufacturer of the digital locks he had installed on the side service doors. And more importantly, I knew exactly how commercial contractors easily bypassed those specific electronic locks during the final construction phases when the local power grid was still highly unstable. Derek arrogantly thought he had completely secured his hidden fortress. But he forgot that he had willingly handed the detailed master blueprints directly to the very man he was actively trying to betray and destroy. I left the motel on the outskirts of the city and drove the gray rental car deep into the affluent northern suburbs. The freezing Chicago wind had shifted into a relentless driving rain that coated the windshield in a thick sheet of ice. I navigated the winding tree-lined streets with the heater blasting, but the chill still managed to settle deep into my bones. I knew exactly where I was going. I pulled to a stop 3 blocks away from the sprawling estate, parking the unremarkable sedan flush against the curb beneath the heavy branches of an ancient oak tree. The rain hammered against the metal roof of the car as I settled into the driver's seat to wait. I rolled the window down just a fraction of an inch, letting the freezing moisture spray across my cheek to keep my senses sharp. Through the veil of the storm, I could see the massive wrought iron gates of the property I had personally funded. For 2 agonizing hours, I sat in total silence watching the heavy front doors. Finally, the massive mahogany garage doors began to slowly ascend. A brand new silver Porsche Cayenne rolled smoothly down the heated snow-melted driveway. The headlights cut sharply through the gray afternoon gloom. I raised a pair of compact binoculars to my eyes. Behind the steering wheel sat Cassandra. She looked absolutely radiant, her hair perfectly blown out, wearing an expensive cashmere coat. She drove past my hidden rental car, without a single glance turning toward the upscale shopping district. That Porsche was bought and paid for with the stolen equity of my daughter's future. I waited exactly 10 more minutes to ensure she had completely cleared the neighborhood grid. Then I grabbed my heavy canvas duffel bag from the passenger seat, stepped out into the freezing downpour, and began the long walk toward the perimeter of the estate. The freezing rain soaked right through my wool coat by the time I reached the edge of the property line. I did not approach the main gate. Instead, I moved silently along the towering, meticulously trimmed hedges that bordered the eastern edge of the estate. I knew exactly where the landscaping crew had planted a cluster of dense evergreens to mask the utility boxes. I slipped behind the thick branches completely shielded from the street and the primary security cameras mounted on the front facade. I approached the side service door. This was the exact door I had advised Derek to install for the catering staff and private contractors. He had equipped it with a high-end biometric digital lockpad, assuming it was impenetrable to the average burglar. But I was not an average burglar. I was the master contractor who had reviewed the original security schematics. I knelt down on the wet concrete and unzipped my canvas duffel bag. I pulled out a heavy-duty, serialized Torx screwdriver and a portable diagnostic tablet. Every commercial-grade digital lock has a hardwired contractor override integrated into the base plate specifically designed for emergency fire access during the final framing stages of construction. If the homeowner forgets to request a secondary digital wipe from the installation firm, that physical backdoor remains completely active forever. Derek was a smooth-talking developer, but he possessed zero practical knowledge of field construction protocols. I slid the blade of the screwdriver under the heavy metal faceplate, popping it loose with a sharp, practiced twist. The internal wiring board was instantly exposed to the damp air. I connected the diagnostic tablet directly to the primary relay pin. I tapped a 6-digit alphanumeric sequence into the screen. It was the universal factory default code for that specific manufacturer. The heavy deadbolt clicked back instantly with a dull, heavy thud. The red light on the keypad smoothly transitioned to a solid, welcoming green. I pushed the heavy door open, stepping out of the freezing rain and directly into the pristine, climate-controlled mudroom of the mansion. I closed the door silently behind me, the lock engaging automatically. I wiped the wet soles of my boots carefully on the utility mat, ensuring I left absolutely no physical trace of my entrance. I stood alone in the absolute silence of the house, my heart beating with slow, heavy, calculated precision. I had breached the fortress. I walked slowly out of the mudroom and into the main living areas of the estate. The scale of the financial betrayal hit me immediately. I was standing inside a monument to my own stolen wealth. My boots made no sound against the imported Italian marble floors stretching endlessly down the main corridor. Above me, massive crystal chandeliers hung from vaulted ceilings, casting a warm glow over the expensive furniture. Every inch of the house screamed of endless, unrestricted spending. I walked into the living room where a massive stone fireplace dominated the far wall. The mantel was lined with dozens of framed photographs. I stepped closer, feeling a cold knot form deep in the pit of my stomach. There were no pictures of construction crews. There were no pictures of a grieving widow mourning a fallen framing subcontractor. The silver frames held vibrant, smiling images of Derek and Cassandra. I stared at a portrait of them kissing on the deck of a private yacht, the blue waters of the Caribbean stretching behind them. Next to it was a photograph of them toasting with champagne at a ski resort in the Swiss Alps. Another frame showed Derek resting his hand on Cassandra's pregnant belly, both beaming with pure joy on the back patio of this estate. The dates printed on the bottom corners of the vacation photographs completely shattered any remaining illusions. The trips had been taken over a year ago. Derek had been orchestrating this massive secret life long before he had ever approached me for the $2.5 million check. Cassandra was not a tragic accident victim he was hiding from a lawsuit. She was his long-term partner. I moved methodically through the dining room, the massive chef's kitchen, and up the sweeping grand staircase. I checked the master bedroom, the walk-in closets, and the lavish nursery being prepared for the new baby. I was searching for anything, any tiny shred of evidence that my daughter had ever been a part of this man's true life. But there was absolutely nothing. There was no trace of Melanie anywhere in the entire 2-story mansion. Her existence had been completely and utterly erased from this property. She was rotting away in a dark, lonely city apartment, heavily medicated and completely isolated, while her husband used her father's money to build an opulent paradise for his real family. The absolute cruelty of his grand design was staggering in its scope. I stood in the center of the grand foyer surrounded by the physical manifestation of my hijacked life savings, and I felt a profound, terrifying calm wash over my entire body. I did not want to simply confront Derek Lawson anymore. I wanted to completely annihilate him. I wanted to strip away every single piece of marble, every crystal chandelier, and every stolen dollar he possessed. I turned around and walked back toward the service door, ready to unleash absolute destruction. I turned around and walked back toward the service door, but I was not leaving just yet. You do not tear down a load-bearing wall without securing the surrounding infrastructure. I needed irrefutable proof of every single crime Derek was committing within these stolen walls. I knelt beside my canvas duffel bag and unzipped the secondary compartment. Inside were 4 military-grade micro-cameras Cole Jenkins had provided me earlier that morning. They were sophisticated recording devices, no larger than a standard coat button, equipped with high-definition audio receivers and night vision capabilities, streaming encrypted data directly to our motel war room. I picked up my tools and walked purposefully toward the grand living room. I knew the exact layout of the central heating and cooling system, because I had personally signed off on the complex ductwork schematics during the initial build phase. I pulled over a heavy leather dining chair, stepping onto it, to reach the ornate brass ventilation grate set high into the wall. Using my screwdriver, I removed the retaining screws and gently pulled the metal grate forward. I reached deep into the dark duct and firmly mounted the first micro camera onto the interior lip, angling the tiny lens perfectly, so it peered completely undetected through the slatted brass. It provided a sweeping view of the entire living room. I replaced the heavy grate, then repeated this meticulous installation process in the formal dining room, embedding the second camera securely inside a hardwired smoke detector. With the common areas fully secured under absolute surveillance, I made my way down the shadowed corridor toward the west wing. I stopped in front of a solid oak door. This was Derek's highly private home office. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The walls were lined with dark cherry wood bookshelves, and a glass-topped executive desk completely dominated the center of the space. I pulled my third and fourth micro cameras from my jacket pocket. I installed one device deep inside the air conditioning return vent, positioned directly above his desk, ensuring a top-down view of any private contracts he might read. The final camera went smoothly into a decorative wall sconce near the primary door. I walked around the large glass desk, testing the heavy wooden drawers one by one. The top 3 pulled open easily, revealing nothing but mundane architectural files. But the bottom right drawer held incredibly firm. It was secured with an integrated mechanical cylinder lock. Derek assumed this robust physical barrier was completely impenetrable. I reached into my pocket and retrieved my specialized steel bypass tools. I slid the rigid tension wrench deep into the bottom of the narrow keyway and applied a very light, steady pressure. With my other hand, I carefully inserted a fine metal pick, gently raking the small internal brass pins. In exactly 20 seconds, I felt the satisfying mechanical click as the tough cylinder finally yielded to my efforts. The contents immediately made my breath catch sharply in my throat. This was not a secure drawer for sensitive financial documents. It was a hidden makeshift pharmacy. Lined up in neat, meticulously organized rows were dozens of small, unmarked amber pill bottles. There were no prescription labels, no medical dosage instructions, and no doctor names printed anywhere. Tucked away in the very back corner, sitting completely separate from the other containers, was a highly familiar white plastic bottle featuring a distinctive blue cap. It was the exact same bottle of supposed anxiety supplements Derek had been consistently giving to Melanie. I picked the white bottle up and slowly tipped the hidden contents into my palm. They were small, chalky white capsules, completely devoid of any pharmaceutical identifying numbers, deliberately manufactured to blend in and avoid any visual suspicion. My hands shook with a terrible, overwhelmingly violent anger. This was the raw poison. This was the destructive chemical agent Derek was secretly using to drug my innocent daughter into a permanent state of total, helpless dependency. He was slowly, methodically stripping away her brilliant mind, keeping her practically comatose in that dark city apartment. I pulled a sterile plastic Ziploc bag from my coat pocket. I carefully counted out exactly half of the chalky white capsules, sliding them securely into the clear bag and sealing the top tight. I was taking these pills directly to Cole to have them thoroughly analyzed by a trusted private toxicology laboratory, but I knew I could not simply leave the white plastic bottle half empty. Derek was a deeply calculating, highly paranoid man. If he noticed his precious supply of pills was suddenly depleted, he would instantly realize his secure fortress had been successfully breached. He would rapidly cover his criminal tracks and find a new, significantly more lethal way to harm Melanie. I had strategically anticipated this exact logistical problem. On my drive to the suburban estate, I had purposefully stopped at a large, bustling chain pharmacy. I had specifically searched for an over-the-counter vitamin capsule that matched the precise size, shape, and dull, chalky white color of Melanie's supposed medication. I pulled a fresh sealed bottle of generic vitamin B capsules from my coat pocket. I meticulously counted out the exact number of pills I had just removed, gently dropping the completely harmless vitamins directly into Derek's blue-capped bottle, drastically diluting the heavy, toxic dosage Melanie was currently receiving. I screwed the blue cap tightly back onto the plastic bottle and placed it exactly where I had originally found it, in the dark back corner of the drawer. I closed the drawer smoothly, using my tension wrench to carefully re-engage the complex mechanical cylinder lock until it clicked securely into its locked position. I pulled a soft, microfiber cloth from my canvas duffel bag and systematically wiped down the entire glass desktop, the polished oak drawer handles, the expensive leather chair, and every single surrounding surface I had even breathed near. I left absolutely no physical evidence behind, leaving no visible fingerprints and no wet footprints on the pristine floors. I walked swiftly out of the home office and moved silently back through the grand foyer, slipping undetected back into the tiled mudroom. I pushed open the side service door, stepping back out into the freezing Chicago rain. I reattached the digital lock faceplate and tightly secured the small retaining screws, leaving the hidden contractor override completely intact and ready for future use. I walked steadily back to my gray rental car, my heavy clothes completely soaked through to my freezing skin, carrying the sealed plastic bag of poison securely in my pocket. The hunt was no longer just about financial ruin. It was a desperate race to save my daughter's fading life. I started the engine, letting the heater blast against my wet hands. The cameras were recording, the pills were swapped, and Derek was completely blind. I pressed my foot heavily against the gas pedal, steering the car back toward the city, ready to drop the final hammer to destroy him forever. That was an absolute promise to myself. I would not rest until he paid for every single ounce of her suffering. For the next 3 agonizing days, my entire universe shrank to the 4 damp walls of that cheap motel room on the outskirts of the city. Cole Jenkins and I transformed the cramped space into a high-tech surveillance bunker. We pushed the 2 sagging double beds against the far wall and set up a bank of glowing monitors across the scratched laminate dresser. I sat in a stiff plastic chair for 72 hours straight, surviving on lukewarm black coffee and sheer, unadulterated adrenaline. I kept my eyes completely glued to the high-definition video feeds streaming directly from the 4 micro-cameras I had secretly embedded inside the sprawling suburban mansion. I watched the silent black-and-white footage with the cold, calculating patience of a sniper waiting in the brush. Through the hidden lens in the grand living room, I watched the sickening reality of Derek's double life unfold in real time. He would leave his downtown architectural office telling my frail, isolated daughter that he was working late to secure their financial future. But the cameras showed exactly where he really went. He would walk through the front doors of that massive estate, strip off his expensive, tailored suit jacket, and immediately wrap his arms around Cassandra. I watched him pour her glasses of sparkling cider. I watched them laugh together on the plush, custom leather sofas my hard-earned money had purchased. The absolute worst moments, the moments that made the bile rise bitterly in the back of my throat, were when he would kneel down on the imported Italian marble floor. He would press his face gently against her swollen pregnant belly, kissing it with a display of deep, fabricated devotion. He was actively playing the role of the loving, expectant father in a luxurious sanctuary, all while his actual wife was wasting away in a dark city apartment. The rage I felt was not hot or explosive. It was a slow, creeping, freezing burn that settled permanently deep inside my chest, hardening my resolve into solid steel. I watched his every move, documenting his routines, his confident strides, and his absolute arrogance. He believed he was completely untouchable. He believed he had successfully insulated his lies behind layers of digital security and concrete walls. But he had absolutely no idea that I was sitting just miles away, watching the walls of his fortress slowly begin to crack. On the afternoon of the third day, the heavy wooden door of the motel room rattled loudly. Cole stepped inside, shaking the freezing rain from his dark trench coat. He did not say a single word as he walked directly over to the small circular table where I was sitting. He pulled a thick, sealed manila folder from the inner pocket of his jacket and dropped it heavily onto the surface. The heavy thud of the paper hitting the table echoed loudly in the silent room. He pulled up a chair across from me, his typically stoic face drawn tight, with a grim, deeply unsettling tension. Cole was a man who had spent his entire career untangling the absolute worst financial crimes committed by the most ruthless corporate predators. He had seen embezzlement, extortion, and rampant fraud. But the look in his eyes right now was fundamentally different. It was a look of profound, genuine horror. I reached out and pulled the manila folder toward me. My hands were perfectly steady. I broke the wax seal and pulled out the crisp white pages of the expedited toxicology report. The private laboratory had run a comprehensive full-spectrum mass spectrometry analysis on the chalky white capsules I had successfully extracted from Derek's locked desk drawer. I spent 40 years reading complex structural engineering blueprints and chemical concrete manifests. I knew how to process dense, highly technical information. But as my eyes scanned the densely packed rows of chemical compounds and molecular breakdowns printed on the pristine laboratory letterhead, I felt the oxygen completely leave the small motel room. I read the long, terrifying list of ingredients once, and then I forced myself to read it a second time, praying that my tired eyes were simply misunderstanding the complex medical terminology. They were not anxiety supplements. They were not harmless holistic vitamins designed to soothe a stressed mind. The pills Derek had been methodically feeding to my only daughter every single day were a highly dangerous, completely illegal chemical cocktail. According to the certified toxicologist, the primary base of the capsules was a massive concentrated dose of heavy benzodiazepines, vastly exceeding any legally prescribed limit. This was aggressively compounded with industrial-strength muscle relaxants, the specific kind utilized for severe physical trauma, designed to completely suppress the central nervous system and induce severe lethargy. But it was the third active ingredient that made my blood run entirely cold. Cole leaned forward, pointing a calloused finger at a specific chemical marker highlighted in bold red ink near the bottom of the second page. He explained the horrific reality of what we were looking at. The laboratory had isolated the presence of a slow-acting synthetic neurotoxin. It was a highly specialized black market chemical compound explicitly engineered to slowly degrade human cognitive function over an extended period of time. When ingested continuously, it would cause extreme vertigo, catastrophic drops in blood pressure, and profound, irreversible memory loss. It was designed to mimic the exact symptoms of a severe, rapidly advancing neurological disease. Derek was not just isolating Melanie to hide his pregnant mistress and his stolen mansion. He was actively, deliberately poisoning her. He was administering a calculated lethal dosage disguised as loving medical care, slowly shutting down her vital organs and destroying her brilliant mind from the inside out. I sat back in the plastic chair, the heavy pages of the toxicology report slipping slowly from my numb fingers. The financial theft of the $2.5 million suddenly felt entirely insignificant. The fake staging company, the secret real estate holdings, the military-grade tracking software installed on her smartphone, all of it paled in comparison to the pure, unadulterated evil sitting on the table in front of me. This was not merely a greedy, manipulative developer trying to secure a lavish lifestyle for his new family. This was calculated, premeditated, first-degree attempted murder. He was slowly killing my daughter in plain sight, using her own trust as the murder weapon. He intended to watch her body shut down, play the role of the grieving, heartbroken widower, and walk away with every single penny of her estate completely unchallenged. I looked up from the scattered medical papers, slowly meeting Cole's grim, hardened gaze across the small circular table. The freezing anger inside my chest rapidly solidified into something incredibly ancient, heavily calculated, and entirely absolute. I had spent 40 long years of my adult life building massive structural foundations meant to securely withstand the most violent storms. Now I was going to use every single fraction of that deeply ingrained knowledge to systematically demolish the pathetic life of the man who had dared to harm my only child. Derek Lawson was a dead man walking. Cole watched the grim realization settle completely over my face, but he did not offer any empty words of comfort. He knew that the toxicological evidence of the attempted murder was only the first half of the horrifying truth he had brought into this damp motel room. He reached back into his heavy trench coat and pulled out a second, significantly thicker manila folder. He tossed the massive dossier directly onto the lumpy motel bed. It hit the worn floral bedspread with a heavy, definitive thud that seemed to violently echo in the cramped, shadowed space. He looked at me with a cold, professional severity. He told me that he had successfully cracked the anonymous shell company. He had spent the last 48 hours relentlessly tracing the routed property tax payments, cross-referencing the hidden offshore accounts, and pulling the complex utility grid registrations for the sprawling suburban estate. The supposedly impenetrable corporate veil of the limited liability company had been completely and utterly torn away. He pointed a steady, calloused finger at the bold black lettering printed across the very top of the primary incorporation document. C&D Holdings did not stand for some generic randomized corporate acronym. It stood directly for Cassandra and Derek Holdings. I stared at the two names permanently linked together in black ink, feeling the absolute gravity flow of the deception pulling heavily at my chest. But Cole was not finished. He reached deep into the thick dossier and pulled out a single certified piece of paper. It was an official state document stamped heavily with a raised foil seal from Clark County, Nevada. He slid it slowly across the small circular table, placing it directly over the horrifying toxicology report. He told me to read the specific names and the recorded dates registered on the certificate. I leaned forward, my tired eyes scanning the formal legal text. It was a perfectly valid, completely documented marriage certificate. The names printed clearly on the official state record were Derek Lawson and Cassandra Miller. The date of the formal ceremony was explicitly stamped at the bottom of the page. It had been officially filed and legally executed exactly 5 years ago. My mind violently struggled to process the chronological impossibility of the dates printed before me. I looked up at Cole, silently demanding a rational explanation. He delivered the final devastating blow with absolute unflinching precision. Cassandra was not a grieving, destitute widow suffering from a tragic scaffolding collapse. She was Cassandra Lawson. She was Derek's legal, fully documented wife. Cole had run a comprehensive, exhaustive sweep of the national divorce registries and every single family court database in the entire country. There were absolutely no separation filings. There were no annulments. They had never divorced. They had never even legally separated. They were and remained a legally married couple in the eyes of the federal government. The sheer, unfathomable magnitude of the betrayal hit me like a physical strike to the chest. I sat back in the cheap plastic chair, the stale air leaving my lungs in a sharp, ragged exhale. The timeline assembled perfectly in my mind, forming a picture so dark and vile it defied basic human comprehension. Derek had married my daughter Melanie exactly 3 years ago in a lavish, beautiful ceremony that I had personally funded. But his highly publicized marriage to Melanie was an absolute legally void sham from the very first day. It was textbook bigamy. He had targeted my brilliant, compassionate daughter with surgical precision drawn entirely to the massive commercial construction wealth I had accumulated over 4 decades of grueling, backbreaking labor. He had never truly loved her. He had never actually cared for her emotional or physical well-being. Every single charming smile he had flashed at our family dinners, every sacred vow he had spoken at the church altar, and every sincere declaration of everlasting love he had ever given to Melanie was nothing but a highly calculated, deeply predatory performance. It was a meticulously crafted stage play designed entirely to siphon my life savings directly into his own pockets. I thought about the massive custom suburban estate I had blindly paid for with a $2.5 million cashier's check. Derek had convinced me it was a secure, protected investment for Melanie's long-term future. Instead, he had maliciously used my hard-earned money to purchase a luxurious hidden sanctuary for his actual legal wife. The heavily pregnant woman arranging decorative throw pillows in the grand foyer was not a desperate charity case. She was the wealthy matriarch of the home I had blindly financed. The baby she was currently carrying was not the orphaned child of a fallen framing subcontractor. It was Derek's biological child. He was actively building his dream life, expanding his real family, and using my hijacked wealth to pay for every single imported crystal chandelier and custom Italian marble tile. Cassandra was completely complicit in the entire horrific operation. She was knowingly living in a massive mansion, bought with stolen money, fully aware that her husband was playing the role of a devoted spouse to another innocent woman just a few miles away in the city. But the financial theft, as massive and devastating as it was, paled in comparison to the sinister reality of the toxic pills sitting in the plastic bag on the table. Derek could not simply divorce Melanie and walk away with the money because the initial marriage was never legally valid in the first place. If Melanie ever discovered the truth, if she ever filed for a formal annulment, or pushed for a thorough financial audit of their shared accounts, the entire criminal structure would instantly collapse. He would undoubtedly face decades in federal prison for massive wire fraud and felony bigamy. He needed to ensure she never asked any questions. He needed to ensure she never had the basic cognitive ability to look at their bank statements or ever question his prolonged absences from the city apartment. That was the horrific underlying purpose of the slow-acting neurotoxin and the heavy industrial sedatives. He was systematically destroying her brain to fiercely protect his stolen fortune. He was attempting to purposefully induce a permanent fatal medical decline, ensuring she would eventually pass away from mysterious neurological complications before she could ever uncover his double life. Every single time he handed her a glass of water and a chalky white capsule, playing the role of the deeply concerned, exhausted caregiver, he was actively executing a highly premeditated financial assassination. I placed both of my calloused hands flat against the cold surface of the motel table. The heavy silence was broken only by the freezing rain lashing violently against the window. I looked down at the forged documents, the toxicology report, and the Nevada marriage certificate. The cold burn of rage inside my chest had entirely consumed me, leaving a profound, unstoppable focus. I was no longer a retired contractor gathering intelligence in the shadows. I was a father preparing to eradicate the monster who tried to bury his child. The time for gathering evidence had passed. It was time to execute demolition. The cramped motel room felt completely devoid of oxygen, as Cole and I sat in total silence, our eyes fixed on the glowing surveillance monitors. The torrential rain continued to batter the thin glass window, but inside the only sound was the low, steady hum of the laptop cooling fan. We had been monitoring the high-definition video feeds for hours, waiting for Derek to let his guard down. The camera hidden inside the decorative wall sconce in the home office provided a crystal-clear, wide-angle view of the massive glass desk and the leather armchairs. At exactly 8:30 in the evening, the heavy oak door of the office swung open. Derek strolled into the frame, still wearing his tailored suit trousers and a crisp white shirt, with the sleeves casually rolled up to his elbows. He walked over to a polished wooden bar cart nestled in the corner of the room, picked up a chilled bottle of expensive vintage champagne, and popped the cork with a very loud celebratory snap. Cassandra followed closely behind him, her heavily pregnant belly protruding beneath a sheer silk robe that cascaded down to the floor. She glided across the expensive rug and collapsed into one of the plush leather armchairs with a heavy, dramatic sigh. Derek handed her a crystal flute filled to the brim with bubbling champagne. He leaned down, kissed her forehead tenderly, and clinked his glass against hers. I watched the man who had solemnly sworn to protect my daughter cheerfully celebrate his stolen life with the woman who was helping him destroy it. The terrifying audacity of their comfort made the freezing anger in my chest solidify into something much darker. Cole sat perfectly still beside me, his hands steepled under his chin, listening intently to the encrypted audio feed streaming through the small desktop speakers. The microphones were incredibly sensitive, capturing every single breath, every rustle of fabric, and every vile syllable they spoke in that room. Cassandra took a long, greedy sip of the champagne, her face twisting into a sharp, resentful scowl. She set the crystal flute down onto the edge of the glass desk with a sharp clink. "I am so entirely sick of this ridiculous arrangement." "Derek," she complained, her voice whining and completely devoid of the tragic grace she had fabricated for me on the balcony. "I am trapped in this giant house all day like some dirty little secret sneaking out the service door just to go to the grocery store. Meanwhile, you get to play house in the city with that sickly, pathetic nurse. I want her gone. I want to walk out my front door without worrying that her senile old father is going to magically show up and catch me watering the hedges." I felt my jaw clench so tightly that my teeth audibly ground together. Hearing my brilliant, compassionate daughter referred to as a sickly, pathetic nurse by the parasite living off her stolen equity was almost too much to bear. But I forced myself to remain seated. I needed the final, irrefutable confession that would seal their fate forever. Derek laughed, a cold, arrogant sound that echoed clearly across the motel room. He walked around the large glass desk and sat heavily in his executive chair. "Relax, babe," he said smoothly, taking another sip of his champagne. "You are overreacting as usual. The plan is moving along absolutely perfectly. Have you seen her lately? The heavy doses I have been slipping into her morning coffee are working better than we ever expected. She barely knows what day of the week it is anymore. Her brain is completely turning to mush. She cannot even stay awake through an entire episode of television, let alone check the joint bank accounts or call her precious hospital colleagues." Cassandra rolled her eyes, crossing her arms defensively. "It is taking too long, Derek. You said this would be finished by the time the baby arrived. I do not want to bring our child into a world where you are still legally bound to that useless woman." The smirk on Derek's face widened into a grotesque, triumphant grin. He leaned forward, looking directly toward the wall sconce where my hidden camera was silently recording. "It will be finished, Cassandra," he promised, his voice dripping with sinister confidence. "Next week, the clueless old man is flying down to Florida to rest his failing heart and have his imaginary surgery. Before he boards that plane, I am going to have him sign the final complete medical power of attorney. He is already terrified of losing his mind. He practically begged me to handle his minor tax accounts yesterday. Once I slide the full estate documents into the stack of papers, he will sign away legal control of his entire $10 million fortune without even reading the bottom line. He is a pathetic, tired old fool who thinks I am the only thing holding his fragile family together." Cole shifted slightly in his chair, his eyes darting toward me for a split second. I stared at the monitor, absorbing the full, horrifying scope of the premeditated assassination plot. "And once you have his money," Cassandra asked, a greedy light returning to her eyes. "What about her?" Derek leaned back, swirling the champagne lazily in his glass. "Once I have total, unchallengeable legal control of the old man's assets, Melanie is going to have a very tragic, fatal tumble down the steep concrete stairs in the apartment building." He stated it so casually, as if he were discussing the weather. We have perfectly established a documented medical history of severe unpredictable vertigo. Her shift supervisor at the hospital already knows she passes out without warning. The medical examiner will see the elevated levels of muscle relaxants and heavy sedatives in her system and rule it a tragic accidental fall caused by her own prescribed medication. Her father will be completely devastated, trapped down in Florida, too weak and broken to even question the official police report. I will play the grieving, heartbroken widower. We take the $10 million, we take the city properties, we keep this house, and we finally get to be together without hiding. We take absolutely everything, Cassandra. We take it all. The audio feed fell silent for a moment, as Cassandra smiled, reaching across the desk to grab his hand. You really are a genius, Derek, she whispered affectionately. I reached out and pressed the mute button on the desktop speakers. The silence in the room rushed back in heavy and suffocating. The cold burn of rage inside my chest vanished, replaced by a profound, absolute zero. I had heard everything I needed to hear. The undeniable proof of bigamy, the toxicological confirmation of the neurotoxin, and now the high-definition audio recording of a detailed plot to murder my daughter and steal my legacy. Derek had mapped out every single step of my destruction. He had calculated my perceived weakness. He thought he held all the cards. The game was officially over. I turned to Cole, my voice perfectly steady. We strike tonight. I will destroy him. I reached out and severed the audio feed, plunging the damp motel room back into a heavy absolute silence. I did not scream. I did not shatter the glowing monitors or flip the flimsy laminate table. There were absolutely no tears left inside of me. Every ounce of grief had been instantaneously incinerated by the recording we had just witnessed. In its place was a crystalline, terrifying clarity. I stood up from the cheap plastic chair, my posture rigid and unyielding. I walked over to the small closet and pulled my tailored charcoal suit from its plastic garment bag. I dressed methodically, adjusting my tie and buttoning my cuffs with the precise, deliberate movements of a soldier preparing for absolute war. Cole remained seated at the surveillance station, watching me with a silent, understanding respect. He knew the grieving father had died in this room. The man standing before him was the architect of Derek's imminent demise. I pulled my phone from my pocket and dialed a number I kept reserved for catastrophic emergencies. I was calling Richard Montgomery. Richard was not a family lawyer or a friendly corporate counselor. He was a ruthless, predatory financial litigator who specialized in completely dismantling fraudulent enterprises. He was a legal assassin, a man who took distinct pleasure in freezing offshore accounts and bankrupting corrupt executives. He answered on the second ring, his voice crisp and alert despite the late hour. I told Richard that I required his immediate presence at his downtown office. I informed him that I was bringing undeniable proof of felony wire fraud, multi-million-dollar embezzlement, bigamy, and premeditated attempted murder. He did not ask any pointless questions. He simply told me he would have his entire legal team waiting for my arrival. I hung up the phone and looked at Cole. We packed up the toxicology report, the Nevada marriage certificate, and the encrypted audio files. We walked out into the freezing Chicago rain, leaving the motel behind us forever. The next 24 hours inside Richard Montgomery's high-rise office were a masterclass in tactical destruction. Cole and I laid out the entire sprawling web of Derek's deception across the massive mahogany conference table. Richard brought in 3 of his most aggressive associate attorneys, and together we systematically built a legal guillotine designed to sever Derek from every asset he had ever touched. We did not simply prepare civil lawsuits. We engineered a complete, inescapable trap. Richard immediately filed emergency ex parte injunctions to freeze the Cassandra and Derek Holdings accounts. We locked down the property deed to the suburban mansion, ensuring that not a single piece of furniture could be legally sold. But the financial blockade was merely the foundation of our attack. Richard utilized his extensive federal connections to open a secure line of communication with the Financial Crimes Division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. We handed over the meticulously documented paper trail Cole had uncovered, showcasing exactly how Derek had illegally siphoned my $2.5 million investment to purchase the hidden estate. The federal agents were incredibly interested in the massive wire fraud, but the audio recording elevated the situation to a significantly higher, much more lethal jurisdiction. When Richard played the crystal-clear audio of Derek casually outlining his plan to drug my daughter and throw her down a flight of concrete stairs, the atmosphere in the room turned ice cold. The authorities instantly recognized the severity of the threat. They began drafting federal indictments for conspiracy to commit murder, alongside the staggering list of financial felonies. Every single exit route Derek could possibly take was being systematically slammed shut and bolted. We spent the entire night finalizing the trap, drinking bitter coffee as the city skyline brightened outside the floor-to-ceiling windows. I reviewed every legal clause, every asset freeze, and every criminal referral with the meticulous eye of a master builder inspecting a load-bearing beam. By the time the morning sun broke through the gray winter clouds, the weapon was fully loaded. Derek Lawson was about to step blindly onto the gallows he had unwittingly built for himself. I stood by the vast window looking down at the tiny vehicles moving through the downtown traffic. It was time to pull the trigger. I needed to bring Derek directly into our controlled environment. I needed to isolate him from Cassandra and force him to bring my daughter into the safety of Richard's office, far away from those steep apartment stairs. I pulled my phone from my suit pocket and took a deep, steadying breath. I closed my eyes and allowed my physical posture to completely collapse. I rounded my shoulders, hunched my back, and let a profound, trembling weakness seep into my chest. I transformed myself back into the pathetic, failing old man Derek so desperately needed me to be. I pressed the call button and listened to the line ring. Derek answered on the third ring, his voice dripping with that familiar, sickeningly smooth charm. He asked how I was doing down in sunny Florida, playing the role of the devoted son-in-law to absolute perfection. I did not respond immediately. I let out a ragged, painful cough, forcing my breathing to sound incredibly labored and shallow. I told him my heart was failing. I injected a raw, desperate panic into my voice, making it crack and tremble as I spoke. I told him the specialists in Florida had discovered a massive blockage and informed me that I required highly invasive emergency surgery immediately. I told him I was absolutely terrified. I explained that I had boarded a private medical flight back to Chicago in the middle of the night because I needed my family by my side. I heard a sharp intake of breath on the other line. I knew exactly what he was thinking. His twisted timeline had suddenly accelerated, and the massive payday was finally within his grasp. I coughed again, gripping the window frame. I told him I was sitting in the lobby of Richard Montgomery's law firm. I begged him to bring Melanie to the office immediately. I told him I was too weak to manage my affairs, and that I needed him to urgently sign the complete medical power of attorney. I told him I was transferring legal control of my $10 million estate directly into his hands today, before I checked into the cardiology ward. I pleaded with him to hurry, playing the dying father, begging his strong son-in-law to save the legacy. Derek devoured the bait. His voice remained soothing, but I could hear the greedy thrill vibrating underneath his words. He promised he was dropping everything, grabbing Melanie, and driving straight to the law firm. He told me to hold on and trust him. I ended the call and lowered the phone. I straightened my spine, rolling my shoulders back as the pathetic old man completely vanished. I turned to face Richard and Cole, who were watching me with grim anticipation. The rat was officially in the maze. Now we had to wait for him to step directly onto the trap. The heavy oak doors of Richard Montgomery's private conference room remained firmly shut, but my eyes never left the polished brass handle. The atmosphere inside the room was thick with absolute suffocating tension. I stood near the floor-to-ceiling windows, perfectly straight, the fabricated weakness of the pathetic old man entirely discarded. Beside me, Cole Jenkins leaned casually against the mahogany wall, his arms crossed over his chest, his sharp eyes fixed on the entrance. Richard sat at the head of the massive table arranging a thick stack of manila folders with surgical precision. Opposite him sat three special agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, wearing immaculate dark suits and radiating an aura of absolute authority. We had carefully staged the room to ensure maximum psychological impact. There was no escape route, no secondary exit, and no possible way for Derek to talk his way out of the concrete vault we had built around him. The digital clock on the wall shifted to exactly 2 in the afternoon. A few moments later, the heavy sound of approaching footsteps echoed softly through the quiet reception area outside. I heard a muffled exchange of voices, the receptionist politely guiding our target toward the designated slaughterhouse. The brass handle turned slowly, and the heavy oak door swung open. Derek Lawson stepped confidently into the room. He was wearing an expensive, tailored navy suit, a crisp white shirt, and a perfectly knotted silk tie. His hair was impeccably styled, and his face was arranged into a mask of deep manufactured concern. But underneath that carefully constructed facade, his eyes were burning with a bright, undeniable greed. He was practically vibrating with the anticipation of securing the $10 million estate. His right hand was wrapped tightly around my daughter's upper arm. He was practically dragging Melanie into the room. My heart shattered and immediately reformed into ice as I looked at my only child. Melanie looked incredibly small, fragile, and utterly exhausted. Her beautiful face was pale and drawn, heavily shadowed by deep dark circles under her eyes. She moved with a slow, lethargic unsteadiness, her feet shuffling across the thick carpet as if navigating a thick fog. Her gaze was unfocused, clouded by the heavy toxic cocktail of industrial sedatives and synthetic neurotoxins Derek had been secretly feeding her for months. She was wearing a baggy sweater that hung loosely from her thinning frame, a stark, horrifying contrast to the vibrant, brilliant nurse she had once been. Seeing the physical toll of his calculated poisoning right in front of me required every single ounce of my willpower to keep from crossing the room and tearing him apart with my bare hands. I forced myself to remain completely still, letting the legal machinery do the work it was designed to do. Derek stepped fully into the conference room, pulling Melanie gently but firmly to his side, ready to launch into his performance of the devoted, terrified husband. He opened his mouth, already forming the words of false sympathy he had undoubtedly rehearsed in the car. He expected to find me slumped in a wheelchair, gasping for breath, surrounded by nothing more than a bored paralegal and a stack of standard medical power of attorney documents. He expected an easy, frictionless handover of my entire life savings. Instead, his words completely died in his throat. The charming, arrogant smile instantly vanished from his face, replaced by a look of profound, unadulterated shock. He stopped dead in his tracks, his polished leather shoes rooted to the carpet. His eyes darted frantically around the room, taking in the scene before him. He saw Richard Montgomery, a man known throughout the city for ruthlessly dismantling corrupt empires, staring back at him with cold, predatory amusement. He saw Cole Jenkins, the private investigator who had spent the last 48 hours entirely dismantling his secret double life, watching him like a hawk. He saw the three federal agents, their gold badges subtly glinting on their belts, their postures radiating serious, undeniable threat. And finally, his eyes locked onto me. I was not hunched over. I was not coughing, and my heart was certainly not failing. I stood tall, my shoulders squared, radiating a quiet, absolute strength that he had clearly forgotten I possessed. The realization began to slowly wash over his face, a creeping, terrifying dawn of understanding. The secure fortress he thought he had built around his lies was already gone, replaced by a prison of undeniable evidence. He looked at the massive stack of files resting in front of Richard, the thick dossiers containing the toxicology reports, the Nevada marriage certificate to Cassandra, the high-definition audio transcripts, and the detailed records of the offshore shell companies. The air in the room grew heavy and cold as the invisible walls of the trap closed tightly around him. For a brief, pathetic second, Derek tried to maintain the crumbling illusion. The survival instinct of a cornered predator forced him to violently suppress the panic rising in his chest. He blinked rapidly, attempting to stretch his face back into the mask of the confused, loving son-in-law. He released Melanie's arm, letting her lean weakly against the edge of a leather chair. He took a hesitant half-step forward, his voice tight and unnaturally high. "Dad," he stammered, offering a weak, trembling smile that failed to reach his terrified eyes. "What is going on here? Where is the doctor?" "I thought we were meeting to sign the power of attorney documents before your flight to Florida. Who are all these people?" He was clinging desperately to the narrative, hoping against all rational logic that this was just a massive, bizarre misunderstanding. He looked at the federal agents trying to project righteous indignation. "What kind of circus is this?" "My father-in-law is a very sick man. He needs immediate medical attention, not a boardroom meeting. I demand to know what is happening right now." I did not raise my voice. I did not move toward him. I simply looked right through his pathetic, desperate facade, staring directly into the cowardly core of the man who had tried to murder my daughter. I let the silence hang in the air for a long, agonizing moment, ensuring he felt the full, crushing weight of his impending doom. "Take a seat, Derek," I instructed, my voice echoing with a cold, terrifying authority that left absolutely no room for debate. "We are doing a very different kind of paperwork today." As the words left my mouth, the lead agent stepped forward, completely blocking the heavy oak door. The trap had finally snapped shut, and there was absolutely no way out. He stared at me, his mouth opening and closing wordlessly as the magnitude of his absolute failure finally registered in his dark eyes. He looked at the federal agents closing in their faces carved from solid stone. He looked back at Melanie, who was slowly realizing something profound was occurring. He walked into this building expecting millions of dollars and a path to his new life. Instead, he walked directly into his own meticulously designed nightmare. It was over. Derek stood completely frozen in the center of the sprawling conference room, his desperate eyes darting between the stern faces of the federal agents and the cold, unyielding stare I had fixed upon him. The heavy mahogany door was blocked, sealing him inside the legal slaughterhouse we had meticulously constructed. I did not raise my voice, nor did I offer him the satisfaction of seeing any trace of my paternal grief. I simply reached across the polished wooden table and picked up the first manila folder from the stack Richard Montgomery had prepared. I opened it with a slow, deliberate movement, extracting a crisp, legally certified document bearing the official seal of a federal judge. I slid the thick parchment across the smooth mahogany surface. It glided silently, stopping exactly inches from Derek's perfectly manicured hands. I watched his eyes track the paper, his breathing growing shallow and erratic. "Read it, Derek." I commanded, my voice sharp and devoid of any emotion. "That is a federal injunction, an emergency ex parte mandate freezing every single asset tied to Cassandra and Derek Holdings. Your offshore accounts, your hidden real estate portfolios, and the deed to that custom suburban mansion you purchased with my money have all been completely zeroed out and seized by the federal government. You do not have a single penny left to your name." I watched the color completely drain from his face, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. The polished, arrogant developer who had strolled into this building, expecting to walk away with a $10 million estate, was rapidly evaporating, replaced by a terrified, cornered animal. He stared at the bold black ink outlining the total financial decapitation of his secret life. His mouth opened to speak, perhaps to deny the existence of the shell company, but the words failed to materialize. He knew that the presence of the federal agents in the room meant his digital firewall had been entirely breached. The money was gone. His luxurious stolen sanctuary was gone. I did not give him a single moment to process the catastrophic loss of his stolen wealth. I reached back into the stack of files and pulled out the second piece of paper. This was the document that elevated his crimes from simple financial fraud to a grotesque predatory violation of human trust. I slid the certified Nevada marriage certificate across the table, placing it directly over the asset freeze mandate. I did not look at Derek as I did this. I looked directly at my daughter. Melanie was sitting in the heavy leather chair beside him. For the past 3 days, ever since I had secretly swapped the toxic, heavily sedating pills in Derek's locked desk drawer with harmless generic vitamins, her body had been slowly flushing out the dangerous neurotoxins. The thick, suffocating fog that had clouded her brilliant mind for months was finally beginning to lift. She was no longer the lethargic, confused victim Derek had dragged out of the apartment this morning. As she stared down at the documents resting on the mahogany table, I could see the sharp, intelligent spark returning to her eyes. She leaned forward, her trembling fingers reaching out to touch the official state seal stamped on the bottom of the certificate. Her eyes scanned the bold text, reading the names Derek Lawson and Cassandra Miller, followed by a marriage date that preceded her own wedding by 2 entire years. I watched the profound, earth-shattering realization wash over her face. The crushing weight of the truth hit her like a runaway freight train. The man she had loved, the man who had solemnly vowed to cherish her, the man who had been feeding her supposed anxiety medication every single morning, was a complete and utter fiction. He was legally married to another woman. Her entire marriage, her home, her presumed illness. Everything was a highly calculated, malicious lie designed exclusively to siphon her father's wealth. Derek realized he was losing his absolute grip on the one person he believed he totally controlled. Panic finally broke through his meticulously crafted facade. He turned away from the federal agents and practically threw himself toward Melanie, dropping to his knees beside her leather chair. He reached out, attempting to grasp her trembling hands, trying to deploy the exact same manipulative tactics he had used to keep her compliant and isolated for the past 3 years. "Melanie, baby. Look at me," he pleaded, his voice cracking with a desperate, manufactured urgency. "You cannot believe any of this. This is a complete fabrication. Your father is losing his mind. He is sick, he is paranoid, and he is paying these corrupt lawyers to forge these ridiculous documents. You know how much I love you. You know I would never do anything to hurt you. We are building a life together. You need to trust me, baby. Please, we need to leave this room right now before he does something even more insane." He was aggressively doubling down on the gaslighting, attempting to force her back into the submissive, confused role he had assigned her. He stared into her eyes, actively projecting the image of a deeply concerned husband trying to protect his fragile wife from a tyrannical father. He assumed the lingering effects of the drugs would make her pliable, hoping she was still too weak to process the undeniable evidence resting on the table just inches away. But Melanie did not shrink away. She did not lower her gaze, and she absolutely did not believe a single word spilling from his lying mouth. The vitamins had completely interrupted his slow, methodical poisoning. Her mind was incredibly sharp, fueled by a sudden, massive surge of pure adrenaline and righteous fury. She looked down at the man kneeling before her, seeing past the expensive suit and the charming smile, finally recognizing the vile, parasitic monster hiding underneath. Melanie stood up from the heavy leather chair. Her movements were no longer slow or uncertain. She pulled her hands away from his grasp. The silence in the conference room was absolute, heavy with the tension of a woman reclaiming her stolen agency. Derek remained kneeling, looking up at her with a mixture of confusion and mounting terror. He opened his mouth to spin another lie, to weave another strand of his web. Before a single syllable could escape his lips, Melanie swung her right arm back and delivered a blinding, vicious slap directly across his face. The impact echoed through the large mahogany room like a gunshot. The sheer force of the blow snapped Derek's head violently to the side. He stumbled backward, losing his balance and sprawling awkwardly onto the thick carpet. A bright red handprint instantly bloomed across his pale cheek. The grand illusion he had spent years meticulously constructing was entirely shattered in a single devastating fraction of a second. Melanie stood over him, her chest heaving, her eyes blazing with a fierce, uncompromising fire. She did not look fragile. She looked like a woman who had woken up from a terrible nightmare and found the monster standing beside her bed. The era of his control was permanently over. Derek remained sprawled on the thick carpet, his chest heaving as his hand flew up to cradle his red cheek. The sharp, echoing crack of Melanie's slap still seemed to ring through the heavy silence of the conference room. For an agonizing moment, no one moved. The three federal agents stood like statues, their faces entirely impassive, watching a predator finally realize he had become the prey. Cole Jenkins leaned against the wall, a faint, deeply satisfied smirk playing across his usually stoic face. Richard Montgomery sat at the head of the table, his hands folded over the stacks of damning evidence. Melanie stepped back, putting distance between herself and the man who had systematically destroyed her reality. She stood tall, her breathing ragged, but her posture incredibly strong. She did not look at him with sorrow or heartbreak. She looked at him with profound, unadulterated disgust. Derek scrambled backward, his expensive shoes scraping awkwardly against the carpet. He realized manipulating Melanie was no longer a viable strategy. The chemical fog had lifted, and her absolute rejection left him entirely exposed. His survival instinct kicked into overdrive, forcing his panicked mind to shift targets. He hauled himself up his tailored navy suit, now rumpled and completely devoid of its previous intimidating authority. He turned his desperate, wild eyes toward the three federal agents standing near the blocked exit. He raised his hands in a defensive gesture, trying to summon the smooth developer persona that had conned so many investors over the years. "Gentlemen, please." Derek stammered, his voice climbing an octave in pure panic. "You have to understand what is happening here. This is nothing but a massive, highly emotional misunderstanding. You are being manipulated by a bitter, resentful father who is actively trying to ruin my reputation. This is a civil family dispute. It is a disagreement over a real estate investment and a personal housing arrangement. My father-in-law is angry because of some marital issues between me and his daughter. He is a sick, paranoid old man who is throwing his money around to manufacture these ridiculous fraud accusations. There is no federal crime here. This is a private matter that belongs in a civil courtroom, not an FBI field office." He was practically hyperventilating, his eyes darting from the impassive agents to Richard Montgomery, begging for someone to buy into his fabricated narrative. He truly believed that if he could just diminish the financial theft into a simple domestic squabble, he could walk out of those heavy oak doors and disappear before the authorities could definitively verify the offshore accounts. He was clinging to the hope that white-collar fraud was too complex to warrant an immediate arrest. I did not interrupt his frantic, sweating monologue. I simply reached into the inner pocket of my tailored charcoal suit jacket. My hand closed around the cold, heavy metal of the digital audio player Cole Jenkins had securely encrypted for me. I pulled the device out and placed it gently onto the polished surface of the conference room table. The soft clink of the metal against the wood immediately drew every single eye in the room. Derek's frantic rambling ground to a sudden, terrified halt. He stared at the small silver rectangle resting beside the Nevada marriage certificate, his breathing freezing in his throat. "You are absolutely right about one thing, Derek," I said, my voice dropping into a low, completely lethal register. "We do not need to waste the time of the Federal Bureau of Investigation on a simple civil real estate dispute." I pressed my finger firmly against the play button. The high-definition audio recording captured inside his private home office crackled slightly before filling the expansive conference room with absolutely perfect, undeniable clarity. Derek's own voice, arrogant and dripping with sinister confidence, echoed off the mahogany walls. "Relax, babe. The heavy doses are working perfectly. Next week, the clueless old man signs the complete medical power of attorney before his fake Florida surgery. Once I have legal control of his $10 million estate, Melanie is going to have a tragic, fatal tumble down her apartment stairs due to her severe vertigo. We take everything." The recording stopped. The silence that followed was not just heavy, it was entirely suffocating. The air in the room seemed to plummet below freezing. I watched the last remaining drop of blood completely drained from Derek's face, leaving him looking like a freshly exhumed corpse. His knees physically buckled beneath him. The reality of the audio recording hit him with the devastating force of a physical execution. He could not spin this. He could not gaslight his way out of his own crystal-clear voice, eagerly mapping out the brutal, premeditated murder of his wife. The charge of wire fraud had terrified him, but the undeniable proof of conspiracy to commit first-degree murder completely shattered his mind. He dropped heavily to his knees, the expensive fabric of his trousers tearing against the floor. The arrogant, predatory developer entirely vanished, leaving behind a pathetic, weeping coward. He threw his hands out toward me, his face contorted in absolute raw terror. He was no longer trying to lie. He was simply begging for his life. "Victor, please," he sobbed, his voice reduced to a pathetic wet whine. "You have to listen to me. I was just talking. It was just stupid, empty talk to keep Cassandra quiet. I would never actually hurt Melanie. You know I could never actually go through with it. I am sorry. I will give you everything back. I will sign the house over to you right now. I will walk away and you will never see me again. Please do not do this to me. I am begging you. I will do whatever you want." I did not move a single muscle. I stood beside the table, completely immune to his tears. The 3 federal agents did not hesitate for another second. The lead agent stepped forward with swift, uncompromising authority. He grabbed Derek's shoulder, hauling the weeping man roughly to his feet. Derek offered absolutely no physical resistance. His body had gone completely limp with the crushing realization that his entire life was over. The agent grabbed Derek's right wrist, twisting his arm firmly behind his back with practiced mechanical precision. The heavy metallic snap of the steel handcuffs echoing through the room sounded like the locking mechanism of a concrete vault. Derek Lawson, the lead agent, stated, his voice ringing out with cold, absolute finality. "You are under arrest for federal wire fraud, felony bigamy, and conspiracy to commit murder. You have the right to remain silent." Derek sobbed uncontrollably as the second agent secured his left wrist. I walked around the edge of the mahogany table. I stopped exactly 1 foot away from him. I looked down into his terrified, broken eyes, feeling the absolute satisfaction of total, uncompromising victory. I leaned down, bringing my face perfectly level with his. "You were right, Derek," I whispered. "I am an old man. But I am the old man who built the empire you tried to steal. Enjoy your new concrete box." As the heavy oak doors of Richard Montgomery's conference room closed behind the federal agents escorting a weeping Derek away, the profound silence of absolute victory settled over the room. I did not celebrate. I simply turned my attention to Cole Jenkins, who was already tapping the screen of his encrypted tactical tablet. We had cleanly decapitated the serpent, but the body of the beast still remained comfortably coiled in the stolen suburban sanctuary. It was time to completely eradicate the final parasite. Cole linked his tablet to the large flat-screen monitor mounted on the mahogany wall, bringing up the live high-definition feeds from the surveillance cameras we had meticulously hidden throughout the sprawling estate. The operation was entirely synchronized. The Federal Bureau of Investigation had coordinated with the local tactical police units to ensure that Cassandra Miller experienced the exact same catastrophic reality check as her fraudulent husband. At the exact same moment, the digital video feed flickered and stabilized, offering a crystal-clear, wide-angle view of the luxurious backyard patio. The contrast between the cold, sterile reality of the downtown holding cell awaiting Derek and the sun-drenched opulence of the mansion was absolutely staggering. Cassandra was lounging comfortably on a pristine white designer chaise positioned perfectly beside the shimmering turquoise waters of the massive infinity pool. She was wearing a sheer, expensive silk robe that loosely draped over her heavily pregnant belly. A chilled glass of sparkling water rested on the small glass table beside her. She raised her left hand to block the bright afternoon sun, casually admiring the massive, flawless diamond engagement ring glittering on her finger. It was a ring purchased with the very funds Derek had aggressively siphoned from my retirement accounts. She looked incredibly peaceful, entirely consumed by her fabricated sense of aristocratic entitlement. She was the lady of the manor, comfortably waiting for her husband to return with the final documents that would secure her stolen $10 million future. I watched the screen with cold, unblinking focus. Through the audio feed, I could hear the faint ambient sounds of the wealthy, isolated neighborhood. The gentle rustle of the wind through the manicured hedges, the soft, rhythmic splashing of the pool filter, and the distant chirping of birds. It was a perfectly tranquil illusion, and it was about to be violently shattered. The destruction of her stolen sanctuary began with a sound so incredibly loud and abrupt that Cassandra physically jumped on her designer lounger. The heavy reinforced wrought iron security gates at the front of the estate were not simply unlocked, they were violently, aggressively breached. The deafening metallic screech of buckling iron and shattering stone echoed through the hidden microphones as two heavy armored police cruisers smashed directly through the barricade. The heavy vehicles roared up the long, sweeping, circular driveway, their massive engines drowning out the quiet tranquility of the upscale neighborhood. The blinding strobe of brilliant red and blue police lights immediately began reflecting off the expensive glass windows of the mansion, casting chaotic, frantic shadows across the pristine lawns and the expensive imported landscaping. Cassandra scrambled awkwardly to her feet, her sheer silk robe falling open as she stared toward the front of the house in absolute uncomprehending shock. Before she could even process the violent intrusion, the heavy wooden side gates leading to the backyard patio swung open with a loud, aggressive crash. A coordinated team of 6 heavily armed uniformed officers stormed directly onto the expensive stone paving. They moved with swift, tactical precision, fanning out across the pool deck to completely secure the perimeter of the backyard. The heavy, rhythmic thud of their tactical boots against the stone shattered the peaceful afternoon silence. Cassandra's initial shock rapidly morphed into a blinding, indignant rage. The sheer, terrifying audacity of her entitlement flared up, completely blinding her to the reality of the tactical situation unfolding around her. She did not cower. She stepped forward, pointing a trembling, manicured finger directly at the advancing wall of uniformed officers. "What in the world do you think you are doing?" she screamed, her voice shrill and echoing loudly through the audio feed. "You are trespassing on private property. Do you have any idea who we are? I demand that you leave my property this exact second. I will have every single one of your badges for this. I am calling my lawyers, and I am calling the mayor. Get off my patio." She was screaming with the aggressive confidence of a woman who genuinely believed her stolen wealth made her completely untouchable. She expected the officers to apologize, to realize they had made a terrible mistake, and to quietly retreat. Instead, the tactical line parted, and a tall, stern-faced lead detective stepped forward. He was wearing a plain dark suit with a gold badge clipped to his belt, and he held a thick stack of certified legal documents in his right hand. He looked at her with an expression of absolute stony indifference, completely unmoved by her hysterical, threatening theatricality. "Cassandra Miller," the detective, stated, his voice booming with a loud, authoritative finality that instantly silenced her screaming. He did not address her by her fabricated married name. He stripped her of the false identity she had used to justify her existence in that house. "This is not your property," the detective continued, stepping directly into her personal space and forcing her to take a nervous step backward. "I am holding a certified federal injunction and an immediate non-negotiable eviction notice. This estate and every single asset located within its boundaries has been officially seized by the federal government under the statutes of civil asset forfeiture. You are currently standing on federal property." Cassandra stared at the paperwork, her mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. The arrogant fire in her eyes was instantly extinguished, replaced by a cold, creeping panic. She shook her head, clutching the silk robe tightly around her protruding belly. "No," she stammered, her voice dropping to a desperate, breathless whisper. "No, that is impossible. My husband owns this house. Derek Lawson owns this house. You have made a massive mistake." "Derek Lawson is currently sitting in a federal holding cell downtown," the detective replied coldly, offering absolutely no sympathy or comfort. "And as of 20 minutes ago, all of his financial assets have been entirely frozen and seized. But the eviction notice is merely a formality, Miss Miller." The detective reached to his belt and pulled a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his tactical pouch. The metallic clinking sound seemed to echo endlessly across the silent patio. Cassandra took another stumbling step backward, her eyes wide with a profound, consuming terror. "Cassandra Miller." The detective announced, his voice ringing out across the pool deck. "You are under arrest. You are being formally charged with federal wire fraud, felony bigamy, and conspiracy to commit the premeditated murder of Melanie Lawson. Turn around and place your hands firmly behind your back." The total catastrophic reality of her situation finally broke through her profound delusion. The luxurious, untouchable world she thought she had brilliantly secured entirely collapsed. She let out a loud, ragged, agonizing scream that tore through the audio feed. It was not a scream of anger. It was the desperate, pathetic wail of a trapped animal realizing it was about to be completely destroyed. She dropped to her knees on the hard stone patio, weeping hysterically, begging the impassive officers to let her call Derek, begging them to reconsider, completely ignoring the fact that Derek had already betrayed her and confessed to the entire fraudulent scheme. 2 officers stepped forward, completely ignoring her tears. They pulled her arms roughly behind her back, securing the heavy steel cuffs around her wrists with a sharp final click. They hauled her back to her feet. The glamorous, arrogant mistress of the house was entirely gone. She was now nothing more than a weeping, broken criminal standing barefoot on the patio in a sheer silk luxury robe. The officers guided her firmly away from the pool, marching her past the manicured hedges and the expensive patio furniture. I watched through the front security cameras as they paraded her down the sweeping driveway, completely exposed to the curious, shocked stares of the wealthy neighbors who had gathered on the sidewalks. They placed her in the back of a waiting police cruiser, slamming the heavy door shut and trapping her in the dark, cramped reality of her new life. The moment the cruiser pulled away, the secondary phase of the tactical operation commenced. A fleet of unmarked white vans and flatbed moving trucks rolled through the shattered security gates. Teams of federal asset forfeiture agents wearing dark windbreakers swarmed the property. They moved with mechanical efficiency, armed with barcode scanners, heavy-duty moving dollies, and clipboards. They bypassed the swimming pool and entered the massive house. Through the interior cameras, I watched them systematically dismantle the fraudulent life Derek and Cassandra had built. Agents moved through the expansive, sunlit living room, slapping bright red seizure tags onto the expensive Italian leather sofas, the imported crystal chandeliers, and the massive modern art pieces hanging on the walls. In the driveway, a heavy tow truck reversed toward the closed garage doors. Agents breached the garage and began securing the luxury vehicles parked inside. They hooked heavy chains to the pristine white Range Rover Cassandra used to run her errands, and the sleek silver Mercedes Derek drove to his downtown meetings. They hauled the expensive vehicles up onto the flatbeds, preparing to strip the property of every single stolen dollar. I stood in the silent conference room watching the monitors as the estate was completely stripped bare. Every piece of furniture, every television, every bottle of expensive wine was carefully cataloged, boxed, and removed. The house that had served as the headquarters for their monstrous deception was being reduced to an empty, hollow shell. The invasive, malicious parasite that had attached itself to my family, feeding on my wealth and plotting the murder of my only child, had finally been entirely eradicated from the host. 6 months have passed since the heavy doors of Richard Montgomery's conference room sealed Derek's fate. The swift, uncompromising gears of the federal justice system ground both Derek and Cassandra into absolute dust. They are currently residing in separate federal lockup facilities, completely stripped of their designer wardrobes, their expensive vehicles, and their fabricated arrogance. The mountain of irrefutable evidence we handed to the authorities left their defense attorneys with absolutely zero room to maneuver or negotiate. The wire fraud, the bigamy, and the undeniable high-definition recording of their premeditated murder conspiracy resulted in a catastrophic cascade of federal indictments. They are both awaiting formal sentencing, facing a mandatory minimum of 25 years in a maximum security penitentiary without the slightest possibility of parole. There were no dramatic courtroom monologues, no tearful pleas for mercy that swayed the judge. They were simply processed and discarded, reduced to identical orange jumpsuits and inmate identification numbers. The grandiose, untouchable lifestyle they had meticulously built on a foundation of my stolen wealth and my daughter's suffering was permanently erased from existence. The majestic $2.5 million suburban mansion, the very symbol of their parasitic greed, was thoroughly seized and aggressively liquidated by federal asset forfeiture teams. Every piece of custom furniture, every imported chandelier, and every single stolen dollar was meticulously tracked down, cataloged, and legally recovered. Richard Montgomery ensured that the entire sum of my original hijacked investment was securely routed back into my private, impenetrable financial trust. The sprawling estate they believed would be their ultimate prize was quickly sold at a massive federal auction to an anonymous corporate buyer. The parasite was not just removed from the host, it was entirely eradicated, leaving absolutely no trace of its toxic presence behind. The financial decapitation was an absolute, undisputed success, restoring my legacy and securing our future against any further predatory attacks. The true victory, however, is sitting quietly beside me right now. Melanie underwent months of intense, grueling medical detoxification to purge the synthetic neurotoxins and heavy sedatives from her system. We paired the physical recovery with rigorous, specialized trauma therapy, allowing her to process the profound betrayal without completely losing herself to the lingering shadows of grief. Today, the fragile, deeply confused woman Derek dragged into the law office is entirely gone. The poison is completely out of her blood. She looks incredibly healthy, her cheeks flush with vibrant color and her eyes sharp with renewed, undeniable brilliance. She has proudly returned to her demanding shifts at the hospital emergency room, saving lives with the steady, confident hands of a woman who stared directly into the eyes of pure evil and survived. She is infinitely stronger and vastly wiser than before. We sit together on the weathered wooden porch of my original modest home, far away from the toxic allure of high society opulence. The crisp morning air fills our lungs as we sip hot black coffee from simple ceramic mugs. We sit in a deep, profoundly comfortable silence, watching the neighborhood slowly wake up. There are absolutely no tears shed for the ghosts of our recent past. There are no dramatic monologues dissecting the horrifying trauma we so narrowly survived. The need for those emotional displays has completely vanished. We simply share the quiet, absolute peace of a family that faced down a monstrous predatory evil and completely destroyed it by using a cold, strictly calculating mind. We forcefully protected our bloodline, we successfully reclaimed our stolen legacy, and we permanently ensured that the greedy monsters hiding behind charming smiles were securely locked inside a concrete cage. Our sanctuary is finally safe, grounded in reality, and entirely untouchable. The heavy storm has permanently passed, leaving nothing behind but absolute, unwavering clarity and unshakable strength. We sit together as a unified force, ready to embrace whatever beautifully ordinary days the future holds for us. True evil doesn't always break down your front door with a weapon. Sometimes it walks in with a charming smile, a tailored suit, and a false promise to take care of you. We are often conditioned to ignore our gut feelings, to keep the peace, dismissing red flags to maintain the illusion of a happy family. But peace built on a lie is just a ticking time bomb. Trust your instincts over sweet words. Protecting your bloodline sometimes requires a cold heart and ruthless calculation. Never apologize for setting hard boundaries, because a predator relies entirely on your endless forgiveness. Have you ever uncovered a devastating truth hidden behind a loved one's perfect smile? How did you find the courage to fight back? Please share your story in the comments below. If Victor's ruthless revenge satisfied you, hit that like button and subscribe for more thrilling tales of ultimate justice.